Hello, I'm Rachel Rickard Straus, editor of Moneywise, and I'm here with Dominic Frisby, who is a financial writer, a comedian, and author of Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. Dominic, thanks so much for joining us to talk about your book.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's get stuck into tax. So it helps keep old people off the streets. It helps ensure that anyone has access to an education regardless of the background of their parents. Does a lot of good stuff, right? So what's the problem with it?
Well, there are numerous problems with our tax system today. And can I stress, this book's not only about the problems with our tax system today, it's all about the past and the future as well, as you know. But the main problem that I have with our tax system today, and I'm talking specifically about the UK, although it's a bigger problem, is we tax labour very heavily. And there are other areas of the economy which we don't tax nearly as heavily. Something like 50% of government revenue comes from income taxes and national insurance. And if you're young and you're starting out with nothing, the only thing you have is your labour. And yet we tax it heavily and constantly. On the other hand, we don't tax assets unless you sell. And so most people avoid selling where they can, or, you know, get all sorts of measures in place to minimise tax when they do sell. But that point of selling is a one-off tax, and it's a lower rate than we pay on income tax. It's not a constant drain of your income. So the result is this society where it's completely geared around the ownership of assets, and it's very hard to make it on the basis of your labour alone. And if you look at the wealth of the super rich, most of them haven't made, except for like football players and rock stars and, you know, CEOs and things like that. Most people don't become super rich on the basis of their labour alone. They become super rich because of the appreciation in the value of their assets, their companies, their equities and so on, which are taxed far less heavily than labour. So my biggest problem with the tax system today is that it penalises labour.
Okay, so we do have taxes for those sorts of things like capital gains tax and like stamp duty, things like that when you sell.
Sure.
But you're saying that unless you sell, it's not realised.
They don't
no
generate
benefit.
anything like as much revenue for the government, and it's not that constant, you know, 25 or 45% off your income.
I guess a lot of this comes from the ease of it, right? That you can take tax, income tax, national insurance at source. It doesn't sting as much for the individual because you never saw it in the first place, and it's much easier for the tax person to bring in.
That's absolutely right.
So
Governments will always tax where it's easy to collect.
Okay.
And the taxing at source, people think that William Pitt introduced income tax during the Napoleonic Wars, but actually William Pitt's income tax was a failure, and it was abandoned in 1801 or 1802, and his successor, Henry Addington, who brought income tax back again to pay for the Napoleonic Wars, and he introduced the idea of taxing at source, deducting the money at source, and his tax was much more successful from the point of view of generating revenue for the government than Pitt's ever was. And but the idea PAYE that we have today, that came in shortly after World War II, but it's a very effective means. There's a famous quote from the finance minister to Louis XIV, which is, "The art of taxation consists of so plucking the goose as to obtain the most feathers with the least possible hissing. And deducting money at source is a good way of obtaining feathers without hissing."
How do you obtain other feathers?
Well, there's all sorts of different systems of taxation have been tried over the years, and you know, some have been successful, some haven't. Some have been successful for a bit and then proved less successful over time. But normally, a government that tries to introduce a new tax during peacetime is very soon finds himself an overthrown government. It's very hard to introduce new taxes during peacetime. It's much easier to use a crisis of some kind, usually a war, to introduce new taxes. And so, for example, income tax came to every man in America in World War II, it came to every man in England in World War I, and it was first introduced in the Napoleonic Wars. I regard inflation as a form of tax because it's a way of extracting money from the people, albeit it's a stealth tax. We saw after the financial crisis, quantitative easing, zero interest rates, all those things that went on. And it was, again, a way of extracting wealth from one group and redistributing it somewhere else.
We should just quickly say how that works, because that seems like quite a big point to make. So that's about making, inflation means that the value of
devaluing money.
Of money that you hold devalues, while debt also devalues, which if you're a government with a lot of debt, that's a good thing.
Absolutely right. And the inflation tax has been levied by many different, famously coin chipping in ancient Rome, but most kings of, the least principled kings and rulers and so on have often employed the inflation tax by, debasing money by some means or other in order to meet their obligations. But yes, so it's a very hard thing to do. In my opinion, and there are people who disagree with this, but if you look at the most heavily taxed societies in history, Soviet Russia, North Korea today, these are countries where the ordinary worker owns none of his own labour or his produce. It's all taken by the state. And then you look at the other extreme, you have countries like the United Kingdom at the turn of the 20th century, tax was about 10% of GDP. Same in the USA. In Sweden, it was actually 4%, incredibly low levels of government spending as a percentage of GDP. And then you look at places like, enlightened civilizations in history. In ancient Greece, taxes were voluntary. And so you have those two extremes, totalitarianism at one extreme, and then, the enlightened society that was ancient Greece at the other. And the developed world today sits somewhere in the middle of those two extremes at 50%, 45 to 50% of GDP. And in my opinion, we're taxed too highly. In my opinion, the individual makes better choices than the government. He will spend his or her money better than the government does. There are many social democrats who don't agree with that worldview, but nevertheless, I would like to see land taxes. I think a land value tax is a much fairer way of taxing people, but I cannot see a way by which a government introduces a land value tax in a time of peace unless it clearly gets rid of a load of other taxes. But that's a much fairer way of taxing people. Now, you said at the beginning of the interview was what are the problems with our tax system. The UK has the longest tax code in the world. It's some 10 million words, 14 times the length of the Bible. It's more words than most people read in their lifetime. Again, the longer the tax code, the more loopholes there are. One group has the resources to find the loopholes and exploit them and navigate them. Another group doesn't, and so that one group, the second group that doesn't, ends up paying more tax. So not only do we tax labour, inequitably, other ways, there are all sorts. The length of the code is another cause of inequality.
But the complexity of the tax system, most of us will encounter a very small proportion of those paragraphs, and the rest don't apply at all. So we need to understand those, and in a digital age where you can do a tax return online that can only perhaps ask you the questions that are relevant to you, it doesn't matter surely to the individual that the rest of it is full of complexity. If it's well governed, if we have a resourced HMRC who can cut down on those loopholes and make sure that people are paying responsibly, does it matter that much that
the first thing
all that complexity?
Yes, it does. The first thing I would say is HMRC isn't well governed. It's notoriously badly governed.
Is that a matter of resource?
Partly. It's also partly to do with an ancient anomaly that taxes are the property of the Crown, and HMRC isn't actually accountable to any government minister. It's only Parliament may say how taxes are spent, but taxes are actually the property of the Crown. And it's just got more and more bloated, and there's this lack of accountability. And there's all sorts of scandals to do with HMRC, and they don't operate by the same rules as everyone else. And, we badly needs... the last time we had a Chancellor who actively cut taxes was Lawson. That's almost a generation ago. And the tax code trebled under Gordon Brown. Osborne came to power promising to simplify it. It doubled in length under Osborne's tenure. It just keeps on growing and growing. And
where's the fun for a Chancellor if they just come in and get rid of things rather than having their own special projects that they can say, this is my legacy, this is my ISA?
With all due respect, tax is not about having fun, despite the fact that this is a fun read. And you look at countries that have simple tax codes. Hong Kong Hong Kong's tax code is 1.5% the length of the UK's tax code. The growth that Hong Kong enjoyed in the post-war era absolutely obliterated the growth that anywhere in the developed world enjoyed. And there is a direct relationship between having a good tax code and having a successful growing economy. And you know, Hong Kong, Singapore copied Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, all these guys in one way or other copied Hong Kong to a certain extent. Even China's copying little bits of it. And the Asian economies have enjoyed much greater growth than we have. We've tended, particularly in Europe and in the UK, you know, we've tended to atrophy. So there's all sorts of problems with our tax code. But to answer your question, it's too long, it's too complicated, and it is not equitable.
Okay, so we need to simplify it, cut it overall, more tax on land and assets rather than on labour.
I'm very careful by saying more tax on land. I would say tax land, not labour. I think we are taxed too much, and I would like to see the overall burden of, you know, tax to GDP be a lot lower than it is, something like half of where it is.
What's too much? What's the sweet spot?
Well, the historical norm is the tenth, the tithe, and I don't think, you know, that was where we were at 1900. I don't think there's a chance. Hong Kong tax to GDP never exceeded 14%. As I say, today we're at 45, 50% more if you include inflation. I'd like to see us back at 20, 25%. Countries that have those kind of low levels of taxation tend to be freer, the people tend to be happier, they tend to be more prosperous. All in all, you have a much more successful society.
How does that square, I wonder, with an ageing society where the number of people who are not working? I guess maybe the answer is that you change the taxation from workers to owners. But I'm wondering, as the need on the state increases, with people needing more older age care, ageing population needing a high number of people needing a state pension, and fewer workers who are providing that kind of base level of income, how do you cut taxes overall while you have those demographic changes?
Well, it's a big problem, and the problem is, you know, successive governments making big promises to win elections about, look at us, we're going to supply this, that and the other. They give themselves all sorts of obligations. Those obligations aren't met by the politician who wins that election. They're left for 2 or 3 or 4 governments down the line. That's the problem for them. There's a short-termist, and it's a major problem that the governments of the West have. They've said, we're going to look after you when you're old. It's not your responsibility to look after yourself. It's not your family's responsibility. They've made these pledges themselves, and it's a big problem. And but you know, the NHS gets more and more bloated. The education system gets more and more bloated. The idea that things like welfare and education and all the things that the government provides would not be provided if the government didn't provide them is mistaken in my view. There are many other, you know, already, you know, the internet, we've seen the most fantastic learning tool ever devised in the history of man in the internet. It's pretty much free. You know, no government provided that. I mean, it was government, NASA or someone who's responsible for the original invention of the thing, but the growth is there. So, you know, it's possible that new technology will make a lot of government services look redundant. If you leave more money in people's pockets, they won't only spend that money buying themselves, you know, new cars. A lot of them will spend that, you know, compassion is a very real part of human nature. And if government is clearly not providing something and there is a need for it, a lot of people will spend their greater incomes on providing that thing. So, you know, I would, again, when you leave money in people's pockets, you also leave the responsibility in people's pockets to provide these essential services that you're talking about. Now, that is very idealistic libertarian chat that I'm coming out with, and I'm well aware of that. But the basic reality is that we have governments that are consistently running deficits. They can't, already tax revenue doesn't cover. The deficit might have got slightly smaller under the Tories, but there is still a deficit, which means the debt grows and grows and grows. We have £2 trillion of national debt. I can't see how that money ever gets paid back unless that currency is significantly devalued. I mean, it's a big problem. And going forward, you know, the biggest growth area in the economy worldwide has been in the digital intangible economy. You know, you look at Wall Street in Silicon Valley in 1990 compared to Silicon Valley today, the market cap of Silicon Valley is something like 60 times higher. Now, the growth of the digital economy has eclipsed the growth in the tangible economy. The problem that governments have is, you know, young people who want to make good, they tend to go and work in the digital economy in some way because that's where the excitement is. Governments have found it very difficult to tax. If you look at the trouble they have taxing Facebook and Google and Apple and all these essentially digital companies, again, they focus on the tax system is geared towards you know, a physical, tangible economy where stuff that's passing through borders. You know, how do you tax 3D printing? At the moment, whatever I get with a 3D printer goes through a border, and it's, you know, you stamp it off and it gets taxed. How do you tax people that are, you know, working for cryptocurrencies and they're hired across the internet in countries overseas? It's much more not as easy to tax as the physical, tangible economy that is inside one border. So you're going to see this is going to be a growing problem for governments, and I think you'll find them getting more and more aggressive with the physical economy. People in the physical economy, because that's where they can tax, people in the physical economy getting more and more outraged. Why should I pay this tax when Google and Amazon and Facebook aren't paying any tax at all? And you'll see this increasing economic divide, but it's going to happen with workers as well. So we have labourers in traditional long-term jobs working for one company all their life, easily taxable. By 2030, Ernst & Young predict that half the workforce, the global workforce, will be freelance. Half. That's 3 billion people. There'll be 6 billion workers in 2030. And of those freelancers, maybe as many as a third, 1 billion people, will be digital nomads of some kind. And they'll do their work in multiple jurisdictions. And, you know, they'll be as hard to tax as Google and Facebook and Amazon are, because they'll just relocate their earnings into tax-friendly jurisdictions. So, you know, the social democracies of today, where, you know, government is responsible for all these things, they've got a big problem on their hands.
But then that sounds like a whole other problem that needs to be addressed, that digital companies find ways of monetising and getting money out of customers and potential customers, and in the same way, surely government should find ways of taxing where it needs to. And I want to just go back to, as I understand what you're saying, government in a sense has to hold its hands up and say, we are overspending, we have too much debt, those promises we made about how we were going to look after you, we can't do it. And then people will say, don't worry, we'll provide those services for ourselves, and private enterprise will come in and say, and don't worry, because we'll provide them for you at a better cost because we're more efficient.
Yeah, I mean, what you've just described is it's a very good sort of summary of what I just said. I don't think there's going to be like a day when that happens. You know, there's a suddenly switch. We're no longer providing this thing. I think this is a gradual process that is going to happen over the next 20 or 30 years.
But look what happens every single time. You have a government who tries to say, not sure we can pay for all of your social care. They lose an election. A government says, actually...
No, I don't agree that they do necessarily lose elections. I think the Tories... you get a lot of noise on Twitter and people who think that government spending should be higher and taxes should be higher, and there's a lot of outrage and a lot of noise, and that's an extremely large pressure group. And you see even the Tories now are trying to own the NHS. We're talking just as the new general election has just been announced, and you can see the Tories keep saying, look at us, we're championing the NHS. But I think most people in the country, you know, there's the George Bernard Shaw quote: a government that promises to rob Peter to pay Paul can pretty much count on the support of Paul. And, you know, governments make big promises to get elected. We need a message. What's our message? NHS. You know, the NHS is a religion for the English. Let's champion it. But I'm strongly of the mind that a government, a political party that stood for lower taxes, greater individual responsibility and less state would find itself surprisingly popular.
If it owned up to the fact that it wouldn't be able to provide the types of things that people
just said, look, the money
expect.
Isn't there. If you want to pay higher taxes and have these things, then vote for the other political party who will give you higher taxes and pay for these things. But if you want lower taxes and more individual responsibility and accept for the fact that for the last, since World War II, since forever, governments have been spending more than they take in, and we're going to try and tighten our belts a bit, and you know, it'll get smeared as austerity or something like that. But you know, I promise you. It's not.
They tried it though, and then you have older,
because no politician has got any imagination.
Because you'll have the older generations who will say, we've paid in all our lives and we're owed X, Y, and Z, and these are not benefits, these are entitlements we put in, so we want out. You have the younger generations who will say, why should people who have gone before us enjoy these privileges and we don't have them? And then there's this sort of slight delusion as well, I think, about the fact that we want social care and state pensions and all these sorts of things, but we also get upset when we're asked to pay more taxes.
It's a big problem, and you're right at the very heart of the problem of government today, in which, you know, prior to the 20th century, all the things that government provides, you know, healthcare and education and so on, were not the responsibilities of government. You know, they were responsibilities of the church and other charities and other private bodies. But since government assumed responsibility for these things, it's assumed this obligation and this responsibility. And, you know, you have to ask, is government the best way to provide these services at the best possible standard, at the lowest possible cost? But it's you know, we're right at the problem of the nature of government at the moment. It's trying to do too much, and it's operating in many areas that perhaps it shouldn't be operating in.
I wonder, in the case of one of the biggest areas of the NHS, where the US, I suppose, could be seen as a counter, where people have more responsibility for their own.
The irony of the US is that the US government spends more per capita on healthcare than the English government does. It's terrible, the US system. It spends, can you believe that? The US government, and people believe that America has private healthcare. It doesn't. The US government spends twice as much almost per capita as the British government does. Isn't that an incredible statistic?
That's a lot of it is down to the sort of the enmeshed composition of the state and
public-private partnerships.
Private.
It is a crony capitalist paradise.
But that's laid open because it's not simply a sort of a state-owned, and the state will get the biggest.
You must not copy America's healthcare system. It is disastrous. You know, places like Switzerland and Scandinavia run healthcare insurance systems that work much better than America's does.
So there's this, you think there's a system whereby the state can rein in a little bit the help that it offers, and you still won't have people who are going bankrupt because they can't.
Listen, I'm a big believer in the power of free markets, but you know, we've strayed a long way, because the NHS, from the subject of the book, you know, which is about the history of taxation, not the merits or lack thereof of the NHS.
Right. Well, let's go back round, and then we should finish. But what's one of the wonderful things about the book is you start with this incredible whistle-stop tour of effectively civilization, and how an issue of taxation is often at the heart of major junctures, whether it be religion or revolutions or wars or whatever it is. Give us a little taster of that.
Well, the broad theory of the book is that the very first taxes were enacted in ancient Mesopotamia when man first settled. And this sense of duty to the greater collective probably existed in hunter-gatherer societies that predated civilization. There has never been, in all history, a civilization without taxation. And you know, there's been good systems of tax and bad systems of tax. Tax wasn't always levied in money, of course. Money wasn't that widespread. Tax was often levied in labour or in produce. You give me a tenth of your, you know, if you're a farmer, you give me a tenth of your crop yields, or if you're an artisan, you give me a tenth of your, you know. So it was, and labour was often taken. You're going to come and fight for me in this war. You know, it's a form of taxation. And tax is how you design a society by the way you tax it. And the way that a society is taxed speaks volumes about that society. As I said, you've got one extreme totalitarian, the other extreme ancient Athens. Taxes are voluntary. How wonderful. Worked beautifully. And that was destroyed by the Peloponnesian War. It's always, there's this odd relationship between war and taxes. War could not happen without taxes. And on the other side, tax often could not happen without war. It was the two world wars that gave us, there's this odd thing, this relationship between the two. And the real hardcore libertarians will just go, no tax, no war. And there's a lot of strength to that argument. But anyway, so I was, reading through the history of tax as I was doing the research for this book, and it occurred to me that you don't just shape a society the way you tax it. Taxes have in fact shaped the entire course of civilization. And once you start to look at the world through this prism of taxes, tax is power. If a king or a government or a ruler or emperor, whatever it is, loses their tax revenue, loses control of taxes, they lose their power. And every war in all history was paid for by taxation, either during the event or afterwards. You plunder and then you tax. Every conquest was about taking control of the tax base, the land, the labour, the produce and the profits. Every conquest. Every revolution was a rising up against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system. No taxation without representation. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the decadence of the bourgeoisie paid for by the decadence of the aristocracy paid for with punitive taxes. French Revolution, Philippine Revolution. Began with the cry of Pugad Lawin, who exhorted Filipinos to tear up their tax certificates. So, and then you go, but it's not just wars and revolutions and conquests. It's religion. Tax is a system of rule, and religion. Who was God, king, ruler, high priest? There was not always that much difference between all of them. King and God were often the same thing. But Christianity was born out of a tax story. Mary and Joseph were in Bethlehem to pay taxes. If Augustus Caesar hadn't levied that tax, Mary and Joseph wouldn't have been in Bethlehem, and Christianity would never have evolved in the way that it did. Non-payment of taxes, sedition, was the charge for which Christ was eventually crucified. It's slightly more complex than that, but the legal technicality they got him on was, they didn't mind alternative religions in ancient Rome, but they wouldn't have alternative kings, because that was a rival to Roman tax revenue. Kings were entitled to collect, and Christ is not a king. This was the big issue. And all the way through the story of Christ, there were, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. Judaism, Moses, the persecution of the Jews by the ancient Egyptians began with punitive taxes, and it eventually resulted in slavery. And Moses led them out of Egypt into the Sinai, where we got the Ten Commandments, to escape these burdens of taxation. There's a tax story at the heart of Judaism. And even Islam, people struggle to understand how Islam became so extraordinarily successful in the space of 30 or 40 years in the 600s, in the mid to late 600s. How did this Islamic empire spread so quickly across the Middle East and Northern Europe? And then you discover that they were going into populations which were extremely tired after decades of centuries even of punitive taxation from the Romans, the Byzantines, the Sasanian Empire, all these various empires, very, very heavy taxes. The Islamic liberators came in and they said, if you convert to Islam, you are exempt from the poll tax. You will not have to pay taxes. If you do not convert to Islam, that's fine, but you have to pay taxes. And if you refuse to pay taxes, we will kill you. And so it was a choice, death, taxes or Islam. Everyone chose Islam, converted to Islam. It was the most, they used the tax system. It was the most effective proselytizing tool in all history. And so at every religion, the heart of every religion even, there's a tax story. The first men on the moon were paid for by taxes. Every great event, I'll find you a tax story in there somewhere.
I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? Because we're all chipping in together to create something that an individual would be unlikely to be able to do themselves.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dominic, for talking us through that. And as you say, we just pay taxes. A lot of us don't even think about what they are, where they come from, and how they've shaped the world around us. So next time maybe we'll, when we get our tax return back, or we get that lovely pie chart we were talking about earlier that tells us what the breakup is of the tax that we spent and what it's contributing to, we'll think a little bit about that and the history of it.
Thank you very much, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Thank you.